Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Government by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and government. My name's Eric Leupold. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So, for our public policy topic this week, we will be looking at economics and more specifically, banking. And so I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robert Murphy. Robert Murphy is Senior Fellow at the Mises Institute and Chief Economist at Infinio. He has a PhD in economics from New York University. Dr. Murphy has taught at Hillsdale College and conducted research at Texas Tech University. He is the author of many economic books aimed at the layperson, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and, more recently, Understanding Money Mechanics. He is the host of the Human Action Podcast, which is put out by the Mises Institute. And I will point out that I enjoy the Human Action Podcast and subscribe to that, and I highly recommend that podcast because the information that Dr. Murphy provides on that is very helpful and very accessible as well. So, and of course, I very much recommend the Mises Institute. They have a lot of good resources, books and articles and such that you can read to understand the topic of economics better. And so with that, here is my interview with Dr. Murphy. All right, well, Dr. Murphy, I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast today. And so before we dive into the always fun topic of economics and specifically banking, I just wanted to ask if you'd be so kind as to tell my listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name's Robert Murphy. I go by Bob. I have a PhD in economics from New York University. I was a college professor for a while. I taught at Hillsdale College and did research at Texas Tech. I worked for Arthur Laffer's firm for a bit. That was my first foray into the private financial sector. And right now, my main role is I'm the chief economist at Infinio, which is a financial tech company. And I also am a senior fellow with the Mises Institute. And mostly a lot of what I do is explaining money and banking to the layperson.
Okay. Well, fair enough. That's a very good job description because I consider myself very much a layperson here. And I know, many of my listeners, if they hear the word economics, their eyes begin to roll back in the back of their head and or they tune out. So, and especially the case if you start telling them about different schools of economics, then their heads might actually explode.
Right. Ease your listeners' anxiety. I have had it happen on multiple occasions where I'll give a public talk somewhere, like, after the housing bubble and crash, I was doing a circuit where I would give after dinner talks to people at conferences. And people would often come up and say, wow, for an economist, you were pretty funny. So it's kind of like, an insult and a compliment at the same time, but still I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I've certainly enjoyed listening to your podcast, the Human Action Podcast, for several years now, and have certainly learned a lot. And that's why I was really excited to have this conversation. And so, kind of joking, 30 seconds or less, could you kind of delineate to my listeners, maybe the two major schools of economics, or at least just like you represent the Austrian School of Economics? What are some of the major principles that underlie that way of thinking?
Sure. So yeah, in economics, it's like this in certain other social sciences too. But yeah, there are what's called schools of thought, and the other ones people may have heard of, like the Keynesian is a very big one. Mm-hmm. And the Chicago School is another one. And the school, it doesn't have to necessarily mean a particular school itself, even though there is a Chicago School of Economics, but the Keynesian school, it wasn't that there was a building called that. Yeah. And so for the Austrian approach, as the name suggests, the original founders were from Austria. That's where the name came from. Some of the big names, Ludwig von Mises, you mentioned the Human Action Podcast. That's for the Mises Institute. That's one of their flagship shows. He was a great Austrian economist who came to the U.S. He actually fled the Nazis and landed at NYU. Israel Kirzner was one of his students there, and Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize in '74 and was also he's one of the biggest Austrians. He wrote The Road to Serfdom, so a lot of people on the right wing in the United States are familiar with that book. As far as what the school espouses, it does tend to be very free market oriented in terms of its policy conclusions, but I want to stress that's not like the the raison d'etre of the school. It's not that we start out saying, oh, we don't like government intervention, let's work backwards and come up with the rationale. It really is its own independent, I would say, scientific analysis, very much rooted in the individual decision maker. It stays away from mathematical models of the economy, thinking it's not just because like, oh, Austrians are bad at math or something. It's that we think that that's not the right way to model human behavior, and that just it gives this false sense of precision when it's not there. And so the Austrian approach tries to be qualitatively accurate as opposed to being very precise but wrong, and which was what we think like the mainstream is liable to do. As far as even among free market oriented schools, like the Chicago school people like Milton Friedman are also very free market generally and don't like the Keynesians who tend to emphasize government intervention, especially like during a recession. But the Austrians, this is the last thing I'll say here because I know you want it to be quick. The Austrians, they take the approach of, hey, markets generally perform better than government planning, even in the areas of money and banking. And so the Austrians think like the central bank as an institution is actually an engine of not just inflation, but also business instability. And in fact, the business cycle, the Austrians argue, is caused by the banking system. And I think we'll probably get into some more of this later in the talk or the discussion. And so that's one area. Whereas like Milton Friedman, if you ask him what caused the Great Depression, he almost says the opposite. He would also blame the Federal Reserve, but say it's because they didn't inflate enough in the early 30s. Whereas the Austrians say, no, it was prior Fed inflation of the 20s that built up this bubble that then crashed in 29. And then we had what we now call the Great Depression.
Just a real quick side question on that is one of the, I guess, delineating principles or ways of thought that, one school would say we need to let people as individuals or as families make their own decisions, and in a way things will tend to work in this, problems will tend to be solved best letting that happen on their own rather than I'm going to sit and gather all this data and try to kind of control or run everything as in a smaller group of people who wield a lot of power and are just, one seems to be more like a centralized mentality, like I need to control everything to avoid all these problems, and the other one is more of a decentralized mentality of like letting, trusting people to make their own decisions. Is that one of the delineating ideas there?
Yeah, certainly, especially if you wanted to use as a foil the Keynesian school. So yeah, when there's a recession, like when Obama came into office after the financial crisis, yeah, the economists who are members of the Keynesian school were saying, oh yes, the Federal Reserve needs to cut interest rates very low. That's probably not going to be enough. The government needs to run huge budget deficits. And the idea was that yes, the private sector left to its own devices would just be stuck in this rut. And it takes the wise intervention from these technocrats who, just have more power at their disposal and are just wiser than the silly, short-sighted people in the market. And that's the role for the government to play. Whereas, yes, the Austrians typically say that that's just going to set us up for another crash. The reason there was the financial crisis in the first place, they would argue, is because of all these prior rounds of government intervention. There was explicit subsidies to the housing sector and so forth. But also, as I say, this more fundamental thing from the Austrian point of view of the central bank just fueling inflation. It pushes interest rates to artificially low levels, gives a false sense of prosperity that causes this boom. So that's partly what fueled the housing bubble, for example. So besides, any one-off historical episode, and the Austrians can kind of look at that and explain all the government interventions in general, yes, just as a theoretical approach, we can explain. It's almost like a two-pronged thing to explain how it is that private property and market prices, profit and loss, help coordinate activities in the marketplace. And so then it's a very complex, decentralized system. And it's fragile in a sense, right? That if you start introducing all these external interventions, thinking, oh, why don't we just go tweak this thing? Like you introduce all these disturbances. And so that's partly the role of the Austrian economist, is to explain, like, there's a lot you take for granted day in and day out about, you just go to the grocery store and you just assume all the shelves are going to be full of food and everything. But there's thousands and thousands of things that go along into making that happen. And you can't just assume, oh, if there's one little facet of that outcome we don't like, let's just pass a law and change that one thing and assume that's not going to have ripple effects and start screwing up other things too.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's such a complicated thing. And you brought up earlier banking, and it seems like one of the key means or methods by which a government tries to get its hands involved in the economy or control things is through banking, through the manipulation of the currency or things like that. And a lot of people, people that listen to this podcast, myself included, we just go to the bank and we think, okay, that's my money. That's all in there. I want to write a check or I want to withdraw cash, and that's it. It's simple, but it doesn't seem like it's that simple. So maybe if you could kind of explain how the current banking situation in the United States is and what role, because people hear about the Federal Reserve, oh yeah, interest rates, this and that, but as a lot of people, including myself, it's all just magic. So, what role does the Federal Reserve play in this, grand scheme of things?
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot there in your question. I'll
sorry.
I'll take a couple stabs at it, and then you just obviously let me know which way you want to take the conversation
Sure.
and where you want elaboration. So, I mean, one thing is we were all born into this system where we just take it for granted that the money is a thing that the government produces.
Yeah.
In the United States, it's dollars, and the European, country, it's the euro, and Japan, it's the yen, and whatever. Historically, that wasn't the case. Historically, it was gold and silver were the money, and then the governments kind of, in a sense, define their own currencies with relation to that. And that's one thing. And I'll jump ahead then and talk about banking today, but just this was something. Only over time did it really seep in, even to my own consciousness, that I used to have this notion in my head that, oh yeah, the dollar was like pegged to gold, but it was actually more that the dollar was defined as gold, right? So originally, like before the Civil War, the U.S. government, it's not like there was a group of people that sat around producing official U.S. currency that was called dollars, and they just had to be careful that, because people could turn them in for gold or silver. That's kind of what I used to think, that, they just had this pledge, this offer, and so that kind of kept them honest. What I just said, that was more like the system after World War II, for example. But originally, it was, no, anybody who had enough raw gold, for example, could go into the relevant office and just turn that over, and they would stamp it into like a gold eagle coin, right? Or a double eagle $20 piece, right? So it was like the people themselves, like the government just said what the rules were, and then the people, in a sense, determined how much coinage there was of official U.S. dollars, right? So it was kind of an interesting system. But anyway, I'm just saying you can see how far we've come from that. But anyway, let's just take for granted that, yes, the dollar is what we're using, and all the dollar is this green piece of paper with dead presidents and some other people on them. And then even so, banking is an extra layer of just like, whoa, that's weird and mysterious and arguably wrong. So I know this probably we're going to get to. So here, yes, let's just take for granted that there's a certain amount of money, physical pieces of paper in the economy, and just take it from there. Even just starting at that point, there's something mysterious going on that, yeah, if you go into your bank and you give them $100 bill and say, I want that in my checking account, they'll go ahead and put it in there. They put it in the vault, let's say. They credit your checking out $100. So you go to the ATM, your balance before was a certain number. Now it's that number plus 100. So you're walking around thinking, I have an extra $100 in my checking account. At the same time, though, now the bank can, I'm obviously simplifying a lot of stuff here, but effectively they can lend that out, or a portion of it out, to somebody else. Let's say they lend $90 of it out, just because in the textbooks usually they do like a 90% thing. So somebody else wants to borrow money and they give them a $90 loan, and so they give it to them. So that person now thinks he has $90, right? Because he's got it. He can go buy something with it. But you don't look at your ATM and see that your account dropped by 90.
Yeah.
You still think you had the 100 you put in there. And so there is a very legitimate sense in which the bank, by just granting that loan, created an extra $90 in the community.
Wow.
And so, and that, and I'm not being metaphorical, like the way economists would, like, you probably see things like M1, M2 and stuff like that, like they're monetary aggregates. Those things include stuff like checking account balances. And so if it's true that by the public putting cash into the bank and converting like the composition of how they're holding their money away from currency into bank balances, that now gives leeway for the banks to grant more loans. And so the total amount that the public thinks they have in the bank is bigger than the amount of original pieces of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the sense in which bank lending can expand the money supply. And the reverse of that's what happened when there's bank runs. It's like, that's why in the early 1930s, prices fell so drastically. It's because people got panicked about the banks. They didn't want to just think, oh, I have a certain amount on deposit with the bank. They were worried that the bank was going to fail. So they would rush to say, I want the cash.
Yeah.
If everybody does that, then the bank has to call in all the loans. And so that process is the mirror image. So, I said before how the bank granting loans could make the community think they had more money than there were pieces of paper in the vault. Well, it's the other way around. If everyone tries to take the money out of the vaults, the total amount of money shrinks, and then there's less spending, and then prices fall. So that's part of what happened in the early 30s, for example.
I guess my question is, has it always been that way in the sense that banks, I mean, even before maybe there was, I don't know, current printed, dollars, could banks always kind of do that? Or was there a time in the United States where a bank actually had to like keep the money that you put in it?
So not in the US, but there was a definitive case. I'm not going to remember the year. It was back in England. I want to say, I think it was either in the 1600s or the 1700s. I can't remember exactly when, but yes, there was a case that kind of was definitive in this area where somebody had put their money on deposit with the bank. The bank lent some of it out. The bank failed or something, and the person sued saying, hey, so the legal distinction here is, if you go and put stuff into a storage unit, like you're a college kid and you're going to go home for the summer and you put your mountain bike in the, some couch that some frat guys got for you. You keep that in a little storage unit when you go home for the summer, then you're going to come back and figure out where you're going to live with your buddies or something. You would be shocked if you came back and then your couch wasn't there and the owner of the storage facility said, oh, I didn't think you were going to show up, and so I lent it out to somebody else. You know what I mean? Like, you would just say, well, that's not what the deal was. I was paying you to store it, right? So with money, it's a little bit different because it's fungible. And so a better analogy would be like, a silo where people are putting grain or something. And it's not that you say, hey, if I'm going to give you this to store, I want this particular bushel back 3 years from now. Like, obviously that's not going to make sense, but still, there's still that element. And so, yes, going back to like Roman jurisprudence, there were these distinctions as it was what called a bailment contract versus a different kind that was like more of a loan. And so the bailment idea, or like a different analogy, you go into a restaurant and check your coat and they give you the ticket. You're thinking they're storing it for you, that they're not letting somebody else wear it so long as, hey, make sure you get this coat back before this guy finishes his meal. You got to be like that's right. But yeah, that is what's going on with banking, right? You're going to give them your money. And the idea is like, oh, don't worry. We probably will have it for you when you want it because we have so many other people doing this and it's fungible. You don't want your particular $100 bill back. So no, probably if all of you give us a big pot of money, we can afford to lend most of it out because the chance of all of you showing up at the same time, it's probably going to be okay. Right. And so it's just kind of a weird system. So to answer your question, the law, at least going back, I said, to that case in England, which, was before certainly the American Revolution. I don't remember if it overlapped with if the colonies existed, but that was carried over to the colonies and then, the U.S. from the English system. And that clearly said, strictly speaking, the way the law handles it, even if you think you're depositing your money and you can say, oh, my money is in the bank. No, when you deposited it, it was no longer your money. They made you lent it to them. They still owe you the money, but it's not yours, right? The way the law treats that, it's not as if they're a storage facility or like a coat check that they're storing your. In contrast, if you put something into a safe deposit box, then the bank legally is just like the custodian of it, right? They're not supposed to take that thing out and go do something with it. Whereas when you hand the money to them, they are allowed. I mean, there's regulations and things. They can't just go to Vegas and gamble it. But you get the point, the distinction I'm trying to make. And so I'm saying, yes, if you're asking, has that always been like that for the modern U.S.? Yes, it has always been like that. And by the way, this, just to be clear, so people don't get misled, other even self-styled Austrian economists think that this is called fractional reserve banking, right? Because the reserves are only a fraction of as opposed to 100% reserve banking. That's like the dichotomy here. So I subscribe to the 100% camp. There are other even self-described Austrians who think fractional reserve banking is fine if it's a free market. We all agree government intervention causes the banks to do things that are not optimal, but the 100% people think in the absence of government privileges and subsidies and, whatever bailouts, we think the banking system, because of competition, would be very close to 100% reserves. Whereas this other camp says, no, in principle, just let the market decide. Who knows what the reserve ratio would be.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong on this. So it seems like, the banks are doing this before the Federal Reserve came into existence. And whatever, it seems like, from what I understand, is that the Federal Reserve is kind of there to, I don't know, like save the banks in case they get these bank runs or everybody wants all their money back, and the Federal Reserve is kind of like a safety net. Is that true or whatnot?
Yes, I think it's true, and it's not a conspiracy theory that the original. So nowadays, if people say, "What does the Fed do?" Somebody would probably tell you something like, "Oh, they're there to ensure, a stable currency, like to smooth out so inflation doesn't get out of hand, and is nice and predictable, and also to try to keep the economy from avoiding boom bust cycles. To have to keep unemployment from getting too high, but also to keep price inflation under control." And those are like the two things. So that's what someone would say nowadays. But originally, if you go look at like the arguments made during the founding of the Fed, and even like what it thought its mission was originally, one of the chief functions was to act as a lender of last resort. And so that's exactly what you just said, Eric, that the idea was, if the banks kind of get caught with their pants down, and we don't want them to fail because, geez, people put their savings in there, and it's kind of a necessary institution. It's not like just like a pizza shop going down or something. That the central bank generally, or the Fed in the case of the U.S., is waiting there in the wings to come in. And ostensibly the theory is they should bail out or lend to banks that are solvent but illiquid, right? So the difference between illiquidity and insolvency, if you're insolvent, that's like bankrupt. That means, you're technically your liabilities are higher than your assets, right? Okay. So you're a failed enterprise. Whereas to just be illiquid means like, oh no, your assets have a higher value than your liabilities, but you're cash strapped. Like it's like if you won the lotto, but you owed your rent to the landlord and you had no money. And it was like, oh no, I'm good. Like I'm worth $10 million. I just don't have any, I'm not going to get paid that until 6 months from now or something, and I owe my rent right now. Right. So if you could just find someone who understood the value of your collateral and would lend against that, you could pay because, I'm good. I'm not bankrupt. So that's kind of the distinction. So the Fed was supposed to come in as a lender of last resort. And this ties into that dispute I mentioned earlier, that the 100% reserve people say, yes, it's because, for example, the Fed is there waiting to rescue banks that get caught because they've lent out too much of their reserves, and now people show up and they want their money, and the banks, geez, I don't got it. If the Fed's there, so the idea is, if the Fed weren't there and they knew we would go down because no one's coming to save us, they wouldn't have been so reckless, and so they would have kept more in the vault. And so that's the argument that guys like me would make in the 100% camp, to say, in a genuine cutthroat competition free market without government waiting to bail these people out when they screw up, the bankers would have to be more responsible in our view, and have reserves closer to 100%.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that clarification there. And there's so many topics I want to go into, but I'm going to stay focused. But I do want to touch on that fractional reserve concept, because it seems like there are many. I guess I would say there are probably many problems with our current economic / banking / financial system. But one of the major ones, not definitely the only one, is this issue of fractional reserve banking. So like, as a Christian, when I read scripture, I read Proverbs 17:27 and other parts of God's word that says that, unequal weights and unequal measures are an abomination to the Lord. And so I think about that, and I'm like, okay, that, to me, ancient rulers, they would debase their currency, whatever, mix silver with whatever, gold with whatever, and then they would basically just cheat people out of gold and silver. I mean, do you think that fractional reserve banking is a violation of that Christian principle? And how is it a violation, if it is?
Okay, so I think probably just to, in case we don't get back to this point, let me just mention there's a huge difference between like what the Fed does and what the private commercial banks do.
I gotcha.
And so just so I'm not misleading, so the private commercial banks, they can't print money. They can't create, new $100 bills. That would be counterfeiting. They'd go to jail if they did that. Whereas the Fed can right now, especially now, post 1971, when there's no tide to gold, the Fed can just buy assets and creates dollars, willy nilly. The banks can kind of, do that in a sense. Like I said, they can just lend money in a sense, create money. But they're, like I said, to say that I have $100 on deposit with Citibank, that's not legally the same thing as having a $100 bill, right? Because technically Citibank could default and then, oops, my $100 goes away. Whereas the $100 bill, that's good. There's nothing that would happen that would make that all of a sudden not be valid, if you get what I'm saying. Right. So there's that distinction. So here it gets dicey because the defenders of the fractional reserve, the practice of fractional reserve banking, they're going to say, no, there's nothing shady about it. Everybody knows, like, what you do. How can the bank pay you interest on your checking account? Obviously, they're putting the money to work. They can't just store it and have ATMs all over the country and have the card system and you can call up if there's fraud or how are they paying all these personnel if they're not taking your money and lending it out and earning interest from it? If they didn't do that, if they really kept 100% in the vault, they would have to charge you for that, right? The service of storing, just like you have to pay the guy running the storage unit to, keep your couch in there or whatever, like you're paying him, right? So that's what they say. So they're saying it's not fraud. I'm kind of agnostic on that narrow point. I understand what they're saying. I do still think, like, even just the way you and I were talking, and people say, no, my money is in the bank and you think it's yours. That's why you said my money. You didn't say the bank's money, but which they owe to me upon demand. You know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't talk like that. You think that my money is in the bank. And when there's a bank, and if the bank all of a sudden, if you learn that your bank was engaged in some shady loans or whatever, and they're in trouble, you'd be worried and you'd be pretty outraged. Like, hey, I thought my money was safe in the bank, right? That's the way you would talk. So there's that element. But for me, the important thing is, and here I'm just following the theory that Ludwig von Mises developed. He thought, again, the business cycle stemmed from this practice of fractional reserve banking. And I think he was right in that. So to me, whether it's technically fraud or not, the fact that the community treats normal circumstances, like when you go to buy groceries and it's $100 and the cashier says, okay, it's $100 for all this food you just got. You can give them a $100 bill, or you can take out your debit card and put it in there. And as long as the bank says, oh yes, he has at least $100 in his checking account, you're good. The grocery store takes that at par with the $100 bill. Whereas you can't, use stock to buy it. You know what I mean? You can't have some baseball cards. No, these really are worth $100. Go look at it.
You can't do Chuck E. Cheese tokens.
Exactly. Right. So I'm saying that that's the special thing that Mises thought, that for good or bad in our community, typically reputable bank balances, back in his day, they had actual notes that the bank issued. We don't have those now. It's like a Federal Reserve note, but it's, to us, it would be like debit card transactions or writing a personal check, as long as the person thought, you weren't lying about what you had on deposit. So people usually will take personal checks at par. They won't like charge a premium against you. And so that's what therefore allows the banks effectively, by their loan operations, to expand the money supply. And Mises thinks that's what causes the business cycle, that sort of instability. So I do think there's something dubious about it. However, I think, like, what the ancient kings would do with debasing the currency, to me, that was qualitatively more dishonest and just outright theft compared to fractional reserve banking, which, again, to me, it's a borderline case that I think is, the public kind of knows what's going on, but also they kind of don't. And then either way, I think in practice that, it's a source of instability.
Yeah, it seems like it's a sense almost in which everything is built on a lie. Like, because I am going around building my my budget or planning whatever vacation or purchases or whatever. I plan my life with the understanding that when I open up my banking app, I see the balances in my checking or my savings or whatever, and that's there. And I'm I'm basing that on, okay, hey, we got a medical need, or I need to buy a new car or something, and say, hey, honey, here's what we got in the bank that we can plan to utilize. So I'm living my life with the assumption that that's my money, it's safe, and it's available. But in reality, it's not really. I mean, it is my money, kind of, sort of, like you said. It's, well, once you give it to the bank, it's not really yours, but but it's not necessarily available. It's theoretically available, but it's just all. It seems like it's all based on this lie, and then you get this false sense of all this money available for people to use, but it's not really real. Like, it's not really there. Am I saying that right?
I think so. So the way some other economists try to like put their finger on just the weirdness of it and what the unreality of it is, or the falseness of it, the falsehood, is that they say it's like multiple people think they have the title to the same unit of money, and how can that can't be right? That there's something screwy there. And also, I would say to buttress my position, even if you think by themselves the commercial banks aren't doing anything that's explicitly fraudulent and that should be criminal, still, I argue the way this system is propped up is through genuinely coercive activities, right? So I think, like in the U.S. FDIC, that fund that they maintain or whatever, so the public thinks, oh yeah, it used to be 100,000. Now it's during the financial crisis, they bumped it up to 250,000. That, oh yeah, I don't even care. I don't need to worry about what my bank does with the money or whatever. Most people, when they're opening up a checking account, don't do research on the portfolio of the bank to make sure, because you think, oh, as long as my account's under 250,000, even if the bank goes down, the government's going to bail me out. I'm fine. And so that, and that's not like a voluntary thing that, the government has that set up coercively, right? So there's that element. And then, like you and I said a minute ago, the fact that the Fed itself is there, certainly the Fed is not a voluntary outgrowth of, mutually advantageous exchanges on the marketplace. No, that was imposed through government coercion. And so I think the only reason the banks can get away with having such low reserve ratios in practice is because of these other genuinely coercive things. And I think if you took those away, that the bankers wouldn't be able to get away with this, and the practice would evolve. So yes, it's, when you're asking, do I think it's malevolent or whatever? Yes, I do. Even if you say that, the bankers themselves are not necessarily explicitly defrauding people just in those narrow transactions. This one of my mentors, Nelson Nash, he passed away, but he was very much into this stuff. And one of his lines, he had an essay, I think he said something, I'm not getting the exact quote, but said something like, fractional reserve bankers allow bankers to lend money that doesn't exist, and that's evil, or something like that, and I think that that's correct.
That's fair. No, and I was wondering, because the connection to the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the promise that if you don't have, we're going to back up your money if it's not there for whatever reason. If there were a bank run and the bank said, I really don't have the money, like I don't have it, and the Federal Reserve says, don't worry, we got you covered. When we asked the question, how would they do that? How would they keep their promise of backing, the $250,000? Wouldn't that require them to essentially print money or create money out of thin air in order to satisfy all these demands? Like, theoretically, it would lead to that, right?
Okay, so just to give you the accurate answer,
so
FDIC itself is run by the federal government, and so they do have it's I think it's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? So it's touted as an insurance company, and so the member banks pay premiums, and so that lets the money pile up in this fund, and then whenever a particular bank gets in trouble, FDIC can come and shut them down. And then, look at all the depositors and make sure that, okay, here are the assets of the bank that failed. And then, okay, do we need to top it off to make sure everyone gets at least $250K?
I gotcha.
Okay. But in terms of, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but a few years ago I did. And it was, in terms of, you look at that fund, what they have in the reserve, and the total number of deposits that they're allegedly covering that says these are FDIC insured, it's like they have less than 1%,
Oh.
if you get what I'm saying there, right? So if in practice there was a major problem and a bunch of banks failed, the FDIC could get depleted quickly. And so then you're right. So, but that money in a sense already existed. Like that's not created out of thin air. That was just like the banks paying premiums.
Yeah.
Just like, a fire insurance company takes in premiums, someone's house burns down, they can send them the check.
Sure.
But then, if that got knocked out, ultimately, probably what happens in practice is the Treasury would lend them the money to pay everybody. And how does the Treasury get it? Ultimately, they would issue bonds, and then the Fed would create money out of thin air to buy those bonds because the Fed can't directly buy bonds from the Treasury. That's illegal.
Oh.
But they kind of do the shell game where primary dealers lend money to the Treasury to get bonds, and then they can sell those to the Fed.
It sounds like a money laundering scheme to me.
Oh yeah, it's really, there almost is a sense in which back in the day when the kings would just explicitly debase the currency, that was almost more honest. Whereas now it's, you know what I mean? It is kind of a shell game where because they say, oh, you don't want to monetize the debt. Like if it ever got to the point where the Fed was just creating money to cover the government's budget deficit, that would be bad. That would be like Banana Republic. But yet, like during the Obama years, there were periods where what the Fed was doing through QE was roughly equal to what the budget deficit was for that quarter or whatever. So it was like, how is that not monetizing the debt? But
yeah, no, okay. I appreciate the clarity on that. And so what I want to then move into is, you mentioned earlier the boom bust cycle, and I'm in my early 40s. I remember the housing market crash. I remember obviously the COVID situation. So we have these cycles, it seems like, and people just talk about it as if they're just, it's just the sunrise and the sunset. Hey, we're gonna have 20 years of good, and then it's gonna be a couple years of bad, and that's just the way things are. And you just have to know when to sell and know when to buy. And that's it. But it seems like you said, fractional reserve banking has a role to play in causing the boom bust cycle. So if you could perhaps kind of explain how it is one of the root causes of the boom bust cycle that we experience.
Sure, and you're right that a lot of economists who are fans of capitalism and the freedom, they'll say, Soviet type central planning, everyone can have a job, but it's just a very ossified system and it doesn't respond. There's no dynamism, and it doesn't respond to new consumer demand and new technologies and whatever. And so in a free society where people are allowed to do what they want, then the downside of that is occasionally someone's going to make a mistake. Someone's going to open up a new restaurant because they don't need to get permission from the Politburo to do it. So anyone who has a dream and the right funding can open up a new restaurant. They hire a bunch of workers, and if it doesn't work out, they just got to close shop, lay everybody off, and everybody's upset. But that's the price we pay for entrepreneurship and freedom, and that gives us the growth that we seek, especially in the long run. And so that's fine insofar as it goes. But when we're talking about the business cycle, it's not just every once in a while a particular firm might fail, right? Because what we're talking about with the business cycle is it seems that there's a clustering of these errors. That it's not just in any given year a certain percentage of people made a mistake. That that would just lead to a steady growth over time. But why is it that there's this periods where there's like this general euphoria and business is booming across many sectors and just about everybody is profitable, and the unemployment rate goes way down and workers are they can just quit and go get a better job and everything's great, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's like there's a major crash and all the businesses are shuttered. Unemployment shoots up to 10% and it stays there for, 2 years. Why does that happen? Like to just say, because sometimes people miss forecast, that seems weird. Like why is there such correlation in the error? So that's what we're trying to explain. And the theory that, like I said, Ludwig von Mises developed to me is the most accurate or compelling of all the different schools of thought and their theories. It says that during a period when the banks are extending loans, with one offshoot of that is like, how is it that if there's like, people put their money in the bank vault and they think they have their checking account, and now the banks say, okay, let's lend out some of this money that's sitting in the vault because it's kind of just sitting there doing nothing. We can go ahead and lend it out, and as long as we get paid back and whatever, then we don't get caught with too many people trying to take their money. We'll be okay, and we'll make more revenue. But to do that, they got to lower interest rates. in order to, move those loans out because they got to get people to want to borrow more money. So interest rates come down. And so the idea is if the original interest rate, when the money was, people had money and they just said, hey, instead of keeping it in my wallet, in my purse, I'd rather store it in the bank vault because it's more convenient, safer. If the interest rate to just keep that, was 5%, but now the banks, in order to get people to borrow more so they can, cut the reserves in half, interest rates come down to 2%. The idea is in the Misesian framework, that's like the wrong signal. That's like signaling to entrepreneurs there's more capital available, there's more savings available. You can start longer projects, right? Because if you're a business person and you're evaluating a long-term project, the interest rate is a key factor in like the net present value of this enterprise, right? So like you're going to build an apartment complex. You got to spend millions of dollars up front to build this thing. But then you're thinking over the next 20, 30 years, once this is up and running, as long as, the occupancy rates are above, 80% or whatever, we'll have this amount of net income year after year. And so the question is just this upfront expenditure, is that more than offset by this flow of net income over time? And for that calculation, the discount rate that you use is a key factor. The higher interest rates are, the less likely you are to engage in this project. So the idea is if the banks, not because the households have actually saved more, but just because they decided to, gamble and drain their reserves, push down interest rates, that sort of gives a green light to all these entrepreneurs to start these long projects, even though there's really not enough savings to bring them across the finish line. Okay. That's kind of the story. So it's like there's this general feeling of euphoria in the beginning when the boom starts and all these entrepreneurs are like, oh, wow, capital's really cheap. Yeah, this project's profitable. I got to hire workers, and you're trying to bid workers away from each other. So wages are rising. Everything seems good. But yet just because the banks decide to empty out the vaults of cash, that doesn't mean there's actually more concrete to go around. There's not more drill presses. There's not more arable farmland, right? And so society hasn't really gotten into a position that it can afford to like take time to build more equipment so that then 5 years from now, the workers are more productive because now there's more equipment they're using, right? That's kind of the idea. And so it's like society is acting as if there's more savings available than there really is.
Yep.
And so Mises says this is a very insidious problem that looks like things are great for a while, and then you kind of hit a wall and then crash because everyone realizes, oops, we were way too optimistic. Right. So I'm kind of simplifying the story, but that's the gist of it.
No, I appreciate that because it seems like that makes sense given, if fractional reserve banking is basically built upon a lie or a falsehood, then again, you're just piling on another lie. You're lending out this money that's not really theirs to lend, and it doesn't really exist, and it just keeps on going. And that's why it seems like to me it's like a drug addiction in many ways, where you feel great for a period of time. You feel like you could take on the world. You start all these projects or whatever, but at some point, like reality hits you. And you have to face it, and you're going to crash. And that's what it seems like is happening in these boom bust cycles, because it's built on a falsehood. Am I understanding this correctly?
Oh yeah. So often Austrian economists will use those sorts of metaphors to either a cocaine addiction or a less provocative one that like a college professor might use is to say to the kids, you got a bunch of exams and you got a paper and you pull an all-nighter, and so you're drinking Red Bull or whatever, and that gets you through. But you can't just keep drinking Red Bull and other energy drinks just to keep doing that. Like eventually you're going to crash, and the longer you persist and keep your adrenaline up and whatever by doing that, the worse off you're going to be. And so likewise in the real world, it is true that yes, as the boom starts to taper, people will say, oh, the Fed needs to inject more credit. Like we need more, because look at the stock market slipping, and look at and we got pockets of price inflation here and there. And so to keep this thing going, we need more credit. And because if you cut it off now, then everything's going to collapse, right? And so you do kind of get into this situation where the Fed has to keep dumping in more and more money to keep the boom going. And the point is, you can't do that forever. And the Austrians would argue, you're not doing any favors by prolonging the boom, right? Like you might think, oh, look we're avoiding pain. But it's like, no, if that factory shouldn't have been built, and the workers going day in and day out to that factory for their shifts are a misallocation of resources. And really they should be going elsewhere in the economy by tinkering with the system to keep it so they keep going there when they're not supposed to. You're just making the final reckoning that much more painful. The sooner we catch the error, the better off we'll all be, even though, yes, it's going to be painful. But the point is, by prolonging it, you're just making it that much more painful when the reckoning actually happens.
It seems like, though, that in our current system, that a lot of, elected officials, since they only live off of, their terms or whatever, it's in their mind, it's like, well, I could just kick the can down the road, and because you don't want to be the you don't want to be the guy holding the bag or stuck with the check. You are trying to do things right, and under your leadership, you are facing reality, and you understand it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. We got to get back to sound principles, but it's going to hurt a little bit. No one wants to be that guy because everyone's going to get mad when things come, crashing down, even though they need to. So the temptation is like, well, I'm just going to keep pushing it off to the next generation, so it's not my problem. There. I mean, do you see that happening a lot in our current system?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I was in the 80s and started getting politically aware, and, I was reading conservative stuff, and I was going and looking at the statistical abstract of the U.S., looking at the Reagan budgets and things like that. A big talking point was how, hey, if we don't reform Social Security, eventually, we're going to get to a point where the amount that the workers pay in each year is less than what they got to pay out to beneficiaries. Well, we're already past that point. That thing that was always this looming, like, oh yeah, at some point we better deal with that. That's now reality, and they're dwindling the so-called Social Security Trust Fund. That's going to expire in the not too distant future. So yes, especially with a democratic system where people, as you say, are only in power for 4 or 8 years, there's not the incentive for long-range planning. So this is the reason that some people associated with the Austrian libertarian school, they actually think that there's a sense in which monarchy, at least in some measures, is better than democracy, because they're, if you're the king and it's like you have your realm, you engage in long-range thinking because it's not just your lifespan, but then you're going to pass it on to your heir, right? And so, yes, if there is some problem where, it would be painful, but it's better to deal with this thing now than to just postpone the problem because it's going to get that much worse. Yeah, if your party won the election and you're in the White House for 4 or 8 years, and you might as well just do something that is okay right now, but is going to really be a big problem 20 years from now. Everyone wants to do that because it's not my problem. Whereas again, if you were a monarch, it's like, no, that's still going to, that's my future self or my kid 20 years. So that's why there is this element that in democracy, even though it may have other things going for it, it does definitely make the political officials much more short-sighted than in other types of frameworks.
I do follow a little bit President Milei in Argentina, and I know that he's trying to fix many of the problems economically going on down there. And I know there's, I imagine there's been some pain that they've had to face. Facing reality. So I'd be curious as to I agree completely that we should not be doing fractional reserve banking, but I imagine that if we were to, let's say, pass a law tomorrow that said, all right, banks, starting next month, 100% reserve banking, no more of this fractional nonsense. I mean, in my mind, it's like that's just taking the drug addict and you're cutting them off cold turkey. With some drugs, you can't really do that because the person will die. So what are your thoughts on regarding is there an optimal solution for fixing these problems and minimizing the pain? Or is it just, rip the Band-Aid off, go cold turkey, and hopefully you don't die of a heart attack kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. So Mises had a really good proposal, I thought. I think he advanced, he's either in the 50s or the 60s. And his idea was that, yes, it would have been good if all along they had practiced close to 100% reserves, but they didn't. And so now the question is, what do we do? And so he came up with an idea where so he was operating on the assumption that the currency was going to be backed up by gold. And so he was saying, let's get it that we announced this, that, starting next month, I'm tweaking the details a little bit. Yeah, starting next month, going forward, anybody who wants, for the bank to lend new money, like it has to be backed up 100% in the vault. Okay, that all newly issued bank notes or whatever are going to be backed up. So it's not that it retroactively makes all the money backed up by gold. It's just saying going forward, any new dollars that are issued either by the federal government or, banks in the act of granting deposits, that newly created, those newly created dollars will be backed up 100%. And then in terms of like, but at what rate, how many ounces of gold or how many dollars per ounce of gold. That's what he said. Like you make the announcement and then just see what the market prices do. And then once you hit the date where you said, this is when we go, like you just lock that price in. So kind of like give the market a sense to like adjust to the new institutional framework. And then, shortly thereafter, once prices settle down, then that's the one you lock in, because you wouldn't want to just announce by fiat, like, oh, we're going to lock it in going forward. Gold's $3,000 an ounce, because maybe that's the wrong price. You know what I mean? Like just to pick a number. And so that's why he was saying, so he kind of combined both, or like all three things, where you need to lock it in, but we don't know what the right price is. So you got to kind of have the market do it, but also the historical amount. Yes, that would be very painful if we tried to make all the existing dollars backed up by gold. And so that's why he said, okay, just you make this announcement and then lock it in going forward, new dollars. So that way it wouldn't cause like a ton of pain from the previous inflation, but it would sort of stop the bleeding, if that's, the metaphor you want to use. So that's one idea. Just in general, I think the way to unwind this stuff is to just introduce as much freedom as possible. So like ultimately, I'd want to end the Fed, but to me, like what you could do next week is just really try to get around any impediments to people using, crypto or gold or silver as alternatives to the US dollar, as opposed to just getting rid of the dollar or something, so that's what I would try to do, is allow people to wean themselves off of their reliance on these systems so that it's more robust, so that when you do start trying to unwind this thing, it's not catastrophic, because it's not like everybody's utterly dependent on this thing, that you've sort of allowed them to, become more independent
and hopefully, take responsibility for their actions, let banks
and it's interesting you mentioned Milei, because he wanted to dollarize, meaning he wanted to get rid of the Argentine currency, and and I've interviewed like one of the guys that was a co-author on like the original blueprint for that plan that Milei had endorsed, and they were saying it is a tough nut to crack. Like that's why they didn't just come in and like on week 3 do it, because they like all these institutions held their domestic currency and assets and liabilities, and all, it was difficult to just turn a switch and say, okay, from now on it's all US dollars. Like they couldn't just do that. And so it was a tricky thing. And it was a multi-stage plan about, okay, we're going to do this. And then once we clean that up, then we'll do this. And because like you say, it's tricky that, there's this idea that if you're going to do something like that, to kind of do it, it's called shock therapy. And some people like that, and some people think it's horrifying, and you can understand why. But the idea being like, hey, if you're going to do a bunch of painful stuff, just, like you said, rip the Band-Aid, do it right away, get it over with, because if it drags on, then you're not going to get reelected. You know what I mean? Like if people just associate your administration with 4 years of misery, whereas if it's like the first year was awful, but then we hit a boom the next 3 years, then, maybe you'll get reelected. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I guess that's that interesting balance that some politicians are just going to have to make. I guess, I don't know. I've heard some things with regard to the most recent election where President-elect Trump is selecting Elon Musk to run this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which...
Yeah. I don't know if you saw, it was like, as we're recording this, it was like an hour and a half ago that, it was going around Twitter. It looked like it was an official thing that it was Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy were going to be in charge of DOGE.
It'll be interesting. The Department of Government Efficiency. Yeah, the government can't be efficient. Anyways, so we're coming up on the end of our time, but I wanted to offer, any last minute thoughts or resources that you recommend for listeners to learn more about this topic, or anything else that you wanted to say that we didn't cover that you really think my listeners should hear.
Okay, thanks. Probably. If the stuff we've been talking about here, I have a book. It's free. You can go to Mises.org and get it. It's called Understanding Money Mechanics. So if you just Google my name, Robert Murphy, and Understanding Money Mechanics, you'll find it. Like I said, there's a PDF, HTML versions for free you can get. And that goes through all the stuff we touched on, Eric, in this discussion with, the origins, like what money was back in the day in the United States when people could just bring raw gold or silver and get them stamped into coins. And so the people, in a sense, determined how many dollars existed, up through the modern era of, commercial banks inflating or contracting, and that causes the boom bust cycle. So that's all spelled out there for people who want to see that in greater detail. And yeah, my podcast with the Mises Institute is the Human Action Podcast. And the stuff we do at Infinio, my other main gig, is taking assets and putting them on the blockchain. And so that's at infinio.ai if people want to go read about that, where it's very free market oriented ideas, but it's also like we're building real stuff for the real world.
Awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation. Maybe in the future you'll come on again. We'll talk about a different economic topic. So again, I really appreciate your time, Dr. Murphy.
Thanks for having me, Eric. Glad to do it.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. And so if you want to follow Dr. Murphy's work, I would recommend subscribing to the Human Action Podcast or going to the Mises Institute, and you can find resources there. So there was so much more that I wish we could talk about, but just due to time constraints, we couldn't get to it. And I hope that maybe I can have Dr. Murphy on in the future to talk about other economic matters. But my goal is that you would see the injustice and the wickedness that's going on with our current banking system and how it contributes to the boom-bust cycle and some of the economic problems that we face. Anyways, please let me know if you have any questions. You can email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and look for Governed by God. You can message me there. And if you have any questions for Dr. Murphy, I will certainly pass them on to him. But with that, until next time, take care and God bless.